On the morning of December 30th, 1999, before the darkness of night had given way to sunrise, people in Ontario, the second largest province in Canada, were slowly starting to wake up. During the previous night hours, Canada's infamous cold had caused everything to freeze over. Many Toronto residents were still in their cozy beds, curled up under warm blankets, when Mohammed Saighani headed out to start his workday. This 48-year-old man, whose short dark hair was starting to turn gray, shivered as the crisp morning air hit him. He pulled up the collar of his winter jacket, tightened it around his neck, and set off toward his car. He had parked his car near the same house where he lived with his family. For several years now, this man, who was also the father of 5 children, had been making a living with his orange taxi, which had a small illuminated sign on its roof. This sign showed passengers whether the taxi was available or not. Muhammad Allah, whom we just call Muhammad here, opened the driver's side door, got into the car, started it up, and turned the heater all the way up. Hoping it would warm up his cold hands, he blew into his hands and rubbed his palms together. After making sure his wallet, with small change and the previous day's earnings in an envelope, was in his coat pocket, he gently pressed the gas pedal, released the handbrake, and started driving. A few minutes later, he saw someone standing by the side of the road. When Muhammad approached with his taxi, the man waved him down. He must have thought to himself, "It's only been 5 minutes since I hit the street, and already my first customer has shown up." He turned on his blinker and pulled over next to the man. Muhammad couldn't have guessed that, at that very moment, his last passenger was getting into the back seat of his taxi. A little after 7 in the morning, a factory worker found a car in the nearly empty parking lot of his company on Iron Street in Toronto. The man and his co-worker, who was sitting next to him, were startled when they saw someone lying on the cold asphalt in the middle of the parking lot under the car's headlights. They hesitantly got out of the car and cautiously walked toward what they had discovered. When they were just a few meters away from the person, it only took a few seconds before they recoiled in horror. One of the men reached into his coat pocket to quickly pull out his phone. With trembling hands, he dialed the emergency number, 911. Frightened, he reported to the operator on the other end that he and his co-worker had found a body. The body was lying in a pool of blood. It looked like one of his thumbs had been severed. His head had also been completely severed. Just a few minutes later, a police patrol officer arrived at the scene where the body was found. The officer cordoned off the area with a large strip of yellow and black tape. Then he quickly notified the homicide detectives. While waiting for the crime scene experts to arrive, he wrote down the names of the employees who had entered the parking lot that morning. After his report, the homicide detectives arrived at the parking lot. They immediately noticed that dark red blood was still dripping from the body's deep wounds onto the black asphalt. This was an important clue because it showed that it hadn't been long since the killer had dumped the victim there. But the homicide detectives noticed that, considering the horrific injuries on the body, there was actually very little blood in the parking lot. So they concluded that the place where the body was found couldn't be the actual crime scene. The medical examiner later recorded more than 50 stab wounds and cuts, most of which were on the victim's neck and hands. The killer had inflicted deep horizontal slashes to the victim's throat and neck, to the point that the man's spinal cord was severed. His head was almost completely separated from his body. One of his thumbs was completely severed from his palm. The police officers present at the scene were shocked by the brutality with which the killer butchered his victim. The situation was so bad that the homicide detectives immediately began their investigation, because they suspected that this killer might have had other plans as well. Because this crime didn't look like a simple fight at all. Everything suggested that some kind of grudge, revenge, or something like that was involved in this murder. Some of the factory workers told the investigators that around 7 in the morning, they saw a taxi leaving the parking lot, the same place where the body was found just a few minutes later. After hearing this, the homicide detectives started wondering whether the victim was a passenger or a taxi driver. Now, they could only find the answer to that if they figured out who the victim was. The first clue to identifying the victim was found by the investigators in the back pocket of the victim's pants, where there was a folded receipt. This document was issued in the name of a man called Mohammed al-Saighani. There was also an address written on that same piece of paper. Two homicide detectives quickly headed toward the address in the west part of the city. When they got there, they found a red rental house. After they rang the bell, a petite woman with long, jet black hair opened the door. She invited them to come inside. The woman's name was Nafis. The detectives told Nafis that a body had been found today in the parking lot of a factory. They explained to her what the victim was wearing. Nafizeh confirmed that her husband had been wearing exactly those clothes when he left for work that morning. But as she listened to what they were saying and confirmed their statements, she became visibly upset and her face turned pale. First, the detectives started investigating Mohammed's personal background. In 2009, about 10 years before he was murdered due to political instability, civil wars, and humanitarian crises, he and his family emigrated from their home country of Afghanistan. In seemingly safe Canada, Mohammed hoped to provide a better life for his wife and child, especially since, up until his death, he and his wife had been married for 28 years. In Afghanistan, his home country, Mohammed was a doctor, but in his new country he couldn't meet the legal requirements to continue working as a physician. That's why he started a new job as a taxi driver in Toronto. But aside from this setback, everything else was going well. By 1999, Mohammed had his own taxi and was earning enough to provide a good life for his family of 7. But the dream of one day being able to work as a doctor in Canada still hadn't left his mind. During the hours when he didn't have any passengers, his co-workers would see him sitting in his car at the taxi stand, studying thick medical books. This hardworking man was highly respected among his co-workers and neighbors. Everyone who knew Mohammed said he was a man of faith. They said he had always been a kind and polite person. All these investigations gradually led the investigators to form the image of an ordinary family man who apparently had no enemies who would want to take his life. After the investigators, with the help of Mohammed's widow, Nafizeh, reviewed the victim's personal background and got nowhere regarding his killer, they decided to reconstruct the day of the incident. Nafizeh, Mohammed's wife, recounted that her husband left the house around 6:15 a.m. on the morning of December 30th, 1999, and started his work shift. That day, he had an envelope with the previous day's earnings with him, which he intended to deposit at the bank. Nafizeh told the investigators that her husband never took any special precautions with his cash, something that always made her angry. Of course, this shows Mohammed's optimism to some extent. Nafizeh recounted that the night before the murder, Mohammed was sitting in his taxi by the street near their house, counting his daily earnings. When he got home, he told his wife in shock that a stranger had suddenly come up to the passenger window and made a comment about the large amount of money he had in his hands. Now the investigators are asking themselves whether the killer could be a violent thief whose only goal was the money. The investigators suspect that the man who saw Mohammed counting money the night before the incident came back the next day to rob this taxi driver. After talking to Nafizeh, it was now time to find Mohammed's taxi. The detectives were hoping that the car would give them some clues about the killer. Maybe, just as they suspected, the car itself was the crime scene. Since there wasn't much time between when the body was found and when Mohammed left home, there probably wasn't enough opportunity for the killer to take him somewhere special to get rid of him. All the city patrol officers were notified that Mohammed's taxi was being sought. The homicide detectives asked the public, through radio and television, to be on the lookout for an orange-colored vehicle. They asked people to report any possible sightings to the police. Meanwhile, the taxi company informed the investigators that there was no record in their computer system showing that Mohammed had been booked by a customer for a ride on the morning of the murder. They guessed that Muhammad had picked up a passenger who was standing by the side of the road, hailing a ride. The news of Muhammad's brutal murder exploded like a bomb, and all his co-workers were in shock. Now, as they worked and drove around the city, they were all keeping an eye out for Muhammad's car. They even wondered to themselves, what if this killer comes after them next? On the afternoon of the incident, several hours after Muhammad's body was found in the parking lot of a factory, the senior prosecutor's office phone rang. The caller on the other end informed him that an abandoned taxi had been found in the parking lot of a supermarket about 106 kilometers north of the Saighani family's home. The homicide detectives immediately headed toward the shopping center, and, among all the other cars, they found the taxi. The advertising sign on the taxi's roof was lit up in the darkness of the night. It showed that the car was empty and ready for the next passenger. The officers stuck their heads inside the car and immediately realized they had found the crime scene where Muhammad had been killed. The windows, seats, dashboard, and ceiling of the car were covered in blood. There were deep cuts everywhere. Even outside, on the driver's side door, you could see blood stains with the naked eye. The investigators immediately dismissed the suspicion that the killer might have been a violent robber, because they saw that there was still a large amount of cash in the taxi. From the pattern of blood stains in the car, the investigators guessed that the killer had probably been sitting behind Muhammad and attacked him from behind. To collect forensic evidence, the taxi was towed and transferred to a specialized police center. Now it was up to the forensic specialists to determine whether the blood in the car actually belonged to Muhammad or not. After that, the forensic specialists searched every inch of the car with adhesive tape to find physical clues from the killer. A lot of hair and fibers stuck to the tape. But for the crime scene experts, it was a disaster in terms of evidence. A taxi that dozens of people ride in day and night is full of clues. So finding a trace of the killer was like looking for a needle in a haystack. They had to sort through all this forensic evidence to pick out the ones that could help the investigators hunt down the killer. While the forensic specialists were busy collecting evidence, the investigators were reviewing the surveillance camera footage. A camera that was installed on the shopping center building. The footage covered part of the parking lot where Muhammad's taxi had been found. The officers' hopes of identifying the killer's face in the videos were quickly dashed, because those VHS tapes had been recorded over many times, which had severely reduced the image quality. At 6:56 in the morning, the camera records Muhammad's taxi entering the parking lot from the street. It was clear that the driver deliberately parked next to a van that had already been parked there. In that footage, the investigators can clearly see the taxi's interior light turn on, and then a few seconds later, it turns off again. The driver gets out of the car and shuts the door firmly behind him. A few moments later, the interior light of the van parked next to the taxi turns on. The person whom the investigators suspect got out of the car is believed to be Muhammad's killer. He starts the van's engine and at 6:57 in the morning, backs out of the parking spot. The detectives were engrossed in watching the footage when suddenly, from the right side of the screen, another car appears, passing through the parking lot. The situation is such that the driver has to brake to avoid colliding with the van that's moving there. The driver of that car is probably one of the supermarket employees. That's why the police officers went to the shopping center and asked the employees if anyone remembered almost getting into an accident with a van on the morning of December 31st, 1999. Maybe with the help of this witness, the investigators could identify the type of vehicle, or maybe even the van's license plate. While some detectives were busy questioning the employees, their colleagues were rewinding and fast-forwarding the videotape to figure out when the van entered the parking lot. The timestamp shows that it was 4:49 in the morning when the surveillance camera recorded the van entering the supermarket parking lot. After the vehicle stops, the detectives can see a mysterious, shadowy figure get out of the driver's cabin and walk away from the van. Now, with the information gathered from the surveillance camera footage and Nafize's statements, the detectives are able to reconstruct that the killer had only a small 45-minute window to murder Muhammad. Because of this, the investigators are certain that the murder of this 48-year-old man was a premeditated act, not a spontaneous crime. The killer must have been familiar with Muhammad's daily routine. After the interrogation of the supermarket employees led nowhere, the lead investigator in the murder case appeared in front of television cameras. He asked the driver whose car almost collided with the van in the parking lot on the morning of the incident, or anyone who knows the suspect driver, to contact the police. Meanwhile, just 48 hours after Muhammad's murder, another taxi driver was attacked with a knife about 50 kilometers from Toronto and died from severe injuries. However, a few days later it became clear that the killers of this man had no connection to Muhammad's case or his killer. But even so, these two brutal murders of taxi drivers in such a short time not only caused great panic among the public, but also instilled fear among the colleagues of these two men. Meanwhile, the police were diligently searching for the killers of the two taxi drivers. On January 4, 2000, almost a week after the murder, Muhammad's funeral was held. In addition to the 800 family members, friends, and acquaintances who prayed for Muhammad at the mosque, hundreds of taxi drivers also came with their cars to pay their respects to their slain colleague. During the prayer ceremony for her husband, Nafizeh fainted several times from overwhelming grief and sorrow. The next day, she told a reporter about the pain of losing her husband, saying, "I don't know if I'm alive or dead." Then, she broke down in tears and couldn't continue. One of Muhammad's daughters said, "I want them to find his killer and slit his throat too. They should do to him exactly what he did to my father." In short, the police received a lot of leads about Muhammad's murder from the public. But none of those leads helped the investigators make any progress. Until January 7, 2000, more than a week after Muhammad's murder, a woman showed up at the police station. She said she was the driver who, on the day of the murder, almost collided with the killer's car in the supermarket parking lot. The woman said the vehicle was a blue minivan with double rear doors. Since the witness wasn't sure about the exact model of the car, the police took her up and down the busy supermarket parking lot streets so she could possibly identify the type of vehicle in question. The investigators got a car of the same model and recreated the scene of Muhammad's murder in the parking lot using that vehicle. In fact, during their tests, they filmed the moment when the killer was escaping using the supermarket's security cameras. Afterwards, they compared their own reenactment footage with the footage recorded on December 30th, 1999. There, they came to a disappointing conclusion. Based on the headlights and other features, the type of car the witness thought they had identified couldn't have been the killer's vehicle. The detectives realized they would have to start their investigation all over again. But the results from collecting evidence inside the car gave the police new hope. Forensic experts found a hotel receipt inside the taxi that was issued in the name of Muhammad. Muhammad had booked that room at the local hotel for the night of November 24th to 25th, 1999. That date was exactly during the time when his wife Nafizeh had been away on a trip for about 4 weeks. Now the police are asking themselves whether Muhammad might have been involved with another woman, and if this wanted killer could be an angry husband or partner. The police officers went to the hotel and questioned the staff, but no one remembered Muhammad. No one knew who Muhammad had shared that hotel room with. Even worse, the police couldn't determine whether Muhammad had cheated on his wife or not. It seemed like there were more and more questions in this case every day. But the suspicion that the victim might have had an affair gave them a reason to take a closer look at Muhammad's habits again. Muhammad, whom everyone described as a calm person, usually spent his free time at home with his family, at the local grocery store, or at a butcher shop that was often a hangout spot for the Afghan community in Toronto. The police talked to the shop owners and customers, hoping to find clues about the taxi driver's killer. But these interrogations didn't get the officers any further. For example, a butcher named Zakrallah Walazada said that he only knew Muhammad and his family superficially and didn't have a close relationship with the Saighani family. So, to make more progress in their investigation, the police asked Nafizeh to let them review their financial records. By reviewing the documents, the officers made a surprising discovery. Nafizeh had signed a loan application for another man. And that man was none other than the 40-year-old butcher, Zakrullah Walazada, who had told the police he only knew the Saighani family as customers. This was really strange. Of course, the police realized that the bank had never approved Nafizeh and Mr. Walazada's loan application, but even so, they wondered why this woman would sign a loan application for her butcher in the first place. The detective spoke with Nafizeh again. At first, the widow denied ever signing such a loan application, but the officers presented evidence, and she admitted that she had signed the form so the butcher could travel to his home country to visit his mother. Now, the butcher confirms Nafizeh's story. But at one point, Walazada tells a different story, and that's what makes the police suspicious of him. Walazada says he wanted to go back to his country to see his sick father. In addition, Nafizeh and the butcher had already told the interrogators that they ran into each other by chance at the airport in early November 1999 and realized that both of them were planning to go to Pakistan. That's why they were on the same flight. Nafizeh told the officers that she had gone to Pakistan for a friend's engagement party. But what made the interrogators suspicious was that Nafizeh and Walazada were also on the same return flight. Do you really think that was just a coincidence? Anyway, after a lot of investigation and careful review, the detectives managed to find a guest from that engagement party who had recorded the event with his video camera. If you enjoyed this case, you can support us by liking and subscribing. By the way, YouTube has added a new button called Hype. If you like a new video from a small channel like ours, you can use this button to help it get more visibility. But keep in mind, you can only use it 3 times a week. Thanks a lot, you guys. The man gladly handed a videotape over to the police officers. The detectives stared at the TV screen with curiosity, now filled with lots of people. Everyone, dressed in bright clothes, was singing, laughing, and dancing in a festive mood. Nafizeh was among them too. She was wearing an elegant evening dress, her hair styled intricately, her face made up, and she was smiling at the camera. But one of the guests really caught the detectives' attention. At that moment, they hurriedly hit the pause button. Now, in the video, a man with a mustache, wearing a white shirt and a tie, could be seen. The person who was with Nafizeh at the engagement party was none other than Zakrullah Walazada, the butcher himself. Even though the video evidence clearly showed that the two of them had a relationship, Nafizeh still denied having any connection with Walazada. But the interrogators didn't believe a single word Nafizeh said. So, in March 2003, a month after Muhammad's murder, Nafizeh came to the police with a request and asked if the investigators would have any problem if she moved somewhere else to live. She said that after her husband's brutal murder and the fact that the killer was still at large, she was afraid to stay in the same house where she used to live with Muhammad and her children. After Nafizeh got permission from the police, she moved to another house in the same city. By then, the detectives had become very suspicious of Nafizeh's behavior and were constantly keeping her under surveillance. During this time, they also noticed that Nafizeh seemed to be surprisingly unconcerned. She was always out shopping, buying fancy clothes, and getting all sorts of furniture, appliances, TVs, and things like that for her house. It was as if she had completely forgotten that just a few months ago, her husband had been murdered. The police definitely didn't think it was normal for Nafizeh to want a fresh start right after her husband's horrific death. That's why, in early April 2000, a few months after Muhammad's murder, they ordered a surveillance team to keep an eye on Nafizeh. Now, undercover officers were following this woman every step of the way. In fact, they noticed some interesting things. For example, on the day Nafizeh drove to a shopping center, she parked her car in the parking lot. Then she slowly walked toward the entrance of the mall. A little while later, she came out of the building again and headed toward a van. She opened the passenger side door and got in. The undercover agents couldn't believe what they were seeing. Sitting behind the wheel was none other than Dasab Walazada. the same person who had always told the police he only owned a small car. The undercover agents started following the vehicle until they reached the front of a hotel parking lot. The criminal detectives were now certain that Nafiz and Valizadeh were planning to have a romantic rendezvous. At the last moment, just as they were about to go to their room, they realized they were being followed. So without doing anything, they left the hotel room again. But the undercover agents had already seen enough. The discovery that Nafiz and the butcher were staying together in a hotel room became a turning point in their investigation. Now, Valizadeh became the center of attention for the criminal detectives. Perhaps the motive for the murder lay in the relationship between Nafiz and Valizadeh. The interrogators once again summoned this 31-year-old man to the police station for questioning. Regarding the recent events, Valizadeh said that he ran into Nafiz by chance at the shopping center. Nafiz, frightened, told him that it seemed like someone was secretly following her. That's why he suggested taking Nafiz somewhere outside the shopping center where they could talk comfortably. The police officers couldn't refute his statement, but after identifying the type of minivan Valizadeh was driving, they went back to review the parking lot surveillance footage. The same place where Mohammed's taxi had been found. To do this, they obtained a minivan of the same make and model as the butcher's minivan. With this vehicle, they then reconstructed the situation that had occurred there early in the morning on December 30th, 1999. Afterwards, the investigators compared their own reconstruction footage with the surveillance camera recording from the morning of the incident. After a thorough analysis, the detectives became fairly certain that the butcher's minivan and the killer's getaway car were a match. This 31-year-old man was now the main suspect in Mohammed's murder case. Before the forensic experts went looking for clues, they impounded Valizadeh's car. Bloodstains were found on the gas and brake pedals and in that whole area. The experts took samples and sent them to the lab for further analysis. But unfortunately, once again, the results were disappointing for the investigators. The bloodstains belonged to animals, which isn't surprising for a butcher. Now the forensic experts started looking for evidence that would show Valizadeh had been in Mohammed's taxi. To compare DNA, they took a blood sample from this 31-year-old man, Valizadeh. Once again, the lab results were a blow to the investigators. There was no trace of Valizadeh's DNA in the victim's taxi. His fingerprints were also not found at the crime scene. Now, the prosecutor's office can't accuse Valizadeh of murder just based on the detective's gut feeling. But these detectives didn't get discouraged so easily. They were determined to find the killer, and besides all this, the case had already become interesting and sensational enough for them. That's why they requested permission from the court to conduct wiretapping in Mohammed's murder case. In short, in June 2000, 6 months after the incident, they finally obtained the legal authorization for their plan. The time for being cautious is over. Now the investigators wanted to have a serious talk with Nafiseh. For 4 whole hours, the homicide detectives talked with Nafiseh at her kitchen table. Without any mercy and completely cold, they put Nafiseh under psychological pressure with all the evidence they had gathered, which showed that her lover, Valizadeh, was involved in the crime, and eventually this led to Nafiseh giving in. She confessed that long before her husband's death, she had been in a relationship with the butcher, but insisted that she had nothing to do with the murder of her children's father, Mohammed Ola. But she gave the interrogators an important lead. She said that after Mohammed's murder, she had sexual relations with Valizadeh. At that time, she also noticed cuts on her lover's body. She drew the locations of the wounds for the detectives on a piece of paper. At this point, the interrogators had no doubt that Nafiseh and Valizadeh were involved in Mohammed's murder. Shortly after her conversation with the interrogators, Nafiseh ended her relationship with Valizadeh. But what was even more interesting was that she started going out with other men. During these relationships, once her ex-lover, Valizadeh, waited in ambush for her when she was coming home from a date. He was really angry, threatened her and said, "I'll kill you just like I killed your husband." Nafiseh's son-in-law witnessed this confrontation. Now because of this threat, Nafiseh is scared and goes to the police with her son-in-law. After that, the prosecutor's office, having heard the son-in-law's account, was convinced enough and filed charges against Valizadeh during that period. Almost 10 months after the taxi driver's murder and 7 thorough investigative steps, on September 18, 2000, handcuffs were placed on Valizadeh. During his interrogation, he confessed that he had a relationship with Nafise and was very angry about the end of their relationship and Nafise meeting other men, but he did not take responsibility for Mohammed's murder. Nevertheless, Valizadeh had no logical explanation for the cuts on his body. He claimed that he got these wounds while working, but the interrogators did not believe him. The prosecutor's office was certain that the jealous Valizadeh had carefully planned Mohammed's murder to have Nafise all to himself. They presented their accusation to the court based on circumstantial evidence, such as the butcher's false claim that he didn't know the Saighani family, as well as the reconstruction of the surveillance footage from the supermarket parking lot and the same minivan that Valizadeh had recently been driving. There were also the cuts on his body, which the butcher couldn't provide a logical explanation for, and even the threat against Nafise, saying he would kill her like her husband. Now, these were the things the prosecutors wanted to use against him during the trial. On January 17, 2003, 3 years after the brutal incident, this 34-year-old man, Valizadeh, was tried in court for the murder of Mohammed. The jury ultimately found him guilty of the serious charge of murder after the presiding judge formally sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for a period of 25 years. Valizadeh promptly appealed the verdict, but unfortunately his appeal was unsuccessful. In Nafise's case, the investigators were unable to gather enough evidence for the prosecution to try her for being an accomplice in her husband's murder. Several years later, in 2017, Zekrollah Valizadeh, the convicted butcher, made headlines for the last time. Defendants who had been sentenced to life imprisonment with a parole period of more than 15 years before December 2, 2011, could apply for early parole after serving 15 years in prison under the Faint Hope Clause. Valizadeh, who had spent all this time trying to pin the murder on Nafise herself, only confessed in 2012 that he was the killer. Of course, he claimed that he killed Mohammed in self-defense and, according to him, lost consciousness afterward. In short, it was brought up in court that during his imprisonment, the convict had improved his English skills, obtained his educational degree, and received a certificate of good conduct from the prison officers. However, Valizadeh had tried to downplay his own main role and also put the responsibility for Mohammed's death on Nafise. In the judge's opinion, who was supposed to decide on the early parole request, this shows that there is still a lot of work left for his rehabilitation and reform. The judge added another point to reject Valizadeh's request, saying it should be reminded that a 25-year sentence without parole for first-degree murder is the rule, not the exception. This year, meaning 2025, this 55-year-old man can submit a regular parole request. So far, no evidence has been found implicating Nafise in Mohammed's murder. There is no source anywhere about how this widow lives today or whether she has remarried. What do you think? Do you think Nafise was truly involved in the tragic murder of her husband, or do you believe that the entire sinister plot was meticulously masterminded by the cunning Zekrollah Valizadeh? This is a complex and intriguing question that leaves much to ponder. Thank you so very much for staying with me and dedicating your valuable time to this discussion until now. Your continued engagement is greatly appreciated. Until we delve into the intricacies of the next captivating case, please take excellent care of yourselves and stay safe.